If you get a chance, please head over to my website, acanthus.com. I'm a furniture maker. At the website, you'll be able to see my portfolio. I also teach woodworking classes all over. As you know, during the first 3 months of every year, I'm on the road with the woodworking shows, teaching seminars and talking to woodworkers just like you. But I also do hands-on classes, and I do presentations for woodworkers clubs all over the country. In addition to my hands-on classes, which you can find the schedule on my website, you'll also be able to take a look at some of the live streaming classes that I've been doing. Now you're sitting there saying, wait a minute, this is live streaming, it's okay. I get to sit here and I watch you demonstrate and teach me these things. But what I'm talking about is something entirely different. We're both audio and video enabled on both ends. So whether it's a skill class or a project class, I will walk you through the steps of each and every process. Then we turn the camera on you and I watch and coach you through the exact same steps. It's something totally different in woodworking education. The people who have participated in the classes I've run so far have been ecstatic. We've been able to create all kinds of things and make better woodworkers from all over the country. In fact, internationally, we've had people participate. This COVID thing may have put the kibosh on us being live and in person at your town, but you can come to me in your shop and we can still make you a better woodworker, help you improve those basic fundamental skills, and have a lot of fun while we do it. So please, again, check out my website, acanthus.com. If you go to the Month of Woodworking Show's website and you click on my profile, there's a link right there to my website. And don't forget, my email address is accessible too. You're welcome to email me with any woodworking questions you have. Now, if you were here for my table saw basics class last week, I said on numerous occasions throughout the class that the table saw is not only the core or center of most woodworkers' power tool shops, it's also one of the most versatile tools that you can possibly own. It certainly does a whole lot more than just straight line rips and cross cuts. And when it comes to basic joinery, rabbets, dados, and grooves, this thing really shines, particularly if we add a stacked dado to it. So let's start by taking a look at exactly what is a rabbet, a dado, and a groove. Then we'll look at how to make them here on the table saw. In this one white pine board, I've got an example of all three types of joints that we're creating at the table saw. I've got a rabbet, which as you can see has a cheek and a shoulder cut, and that's all. A dado, which has 2 shoulder cuts and a cheek cut, and a groove, which has 2 shoulder cuts and a cheek cut. In reality, these are not actually shoulder cuts on the side. We've just lowered this. So the difference between a dado and a groove has to do with the direction it travels with or across the grain. A dado goes across the grain, a groove goes with the grain. Why? I don't know, because I made them both with a dado stack. So the reality is they both have a U-shaped channel in there. It's 2 sidewalls and a bottom. We can turn around and make any of these joints with a dado stack, which we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But you could also make them with just a normal, ordinary table saw blade if you don't have a dado stack for your saw. So let's demonstrate real quick how I would go about making the rabbet and the dado using nothing but a table saw blade. In order to be really accurate when you lay out your rabbets and your dados and grooves, the best thing to do is hold the boards in position and transfer the marks. At that point, you can use them to set up the machine. The first cut I'm going to make on my rabbet is a shoulder cut. I don't need it to be exact depth, I just need it to be within the thickness of the blade, close to that top line. I'm then going to use the board that I'm putting into the rabbet. I want to line it up with the outside of my blade so that it is either flush or just have the slightest bit of the blade sticking out. Now I can make my shoulder cut. With my tending jig, which you'll see in a few weeks, I set the depth of my cut first, then bring the board over, holding it up against the jig, and line it up with the inside edge of the blade, and now I can make my cheek cut. If I got my height set just right, the rabbet should fit together with no problems. You can see it comes up really nice and clean, nice tight joint. To lay out my dado, the first thing I'm going to do is clamp my two boards together, scribe off the adjoining board to the board that I'm going to cut the dado in, transfer those marks to the edge, mark my center, and then I'm going to square those little tick marks up to give me the left and right or outsides of my dado. With my miter gauge installed on the saw, I clamp an auxiliary fence to that miter gauge, hold the board into position, line it up with the outside of the blade, and then I can set a stop block on the right hand end of my board. Once I get that set, I then move the board over to the inside position up against the other side of my dado and set another stop block. Now it's pretty easy. Turn on the saw and move my board back and forth between the two stops. The joint fits perfectly, but you can see there are just a few little spots at the bottom edge of that board. When I flip it over, you'll see it even better. You'll see those little nicks. Those are left from the top of my saw blade. I can go back in there with a chisel and clean them up, but that's an awful lot of work. And honestly, that's where the stack dado comes in So I've got 3 different style stack dados here. And although this one doesn't really look like a stack, it actually is. The first one that I've got is just your run-of-the-mill. This is the thing that's been around for decades. It consists of 2 outer saw blades. They're just filed with an alternating top bevel on the teeth, because that way it works for cross cuts. And then what you've got is a series of these chippers that get stacked in between to create whatever width you need. Some of these sets come with washers that you can then micro adjust the width of the dado stack. When you set them up, the object is to get them on the arbor of the saw, and then you'll set the carbide teeth down into the gullets and space them out evenly as you go around the stack. The idea is you want to keep the weight evenly distributed, and then you don't want the carbide binding up against the carbide. It does protrude slightly past the surface of the saw plate itself. If you have it binding carbide to carbide when you tighten it down, you could very easily chip the carbide or even knock off a tooth. These are pretty inexpensive, these standard dado stacks at this point. You can get them from anywhere from, I've seen them as low as $50 on up to a couple of hundred, depending on who makes it and the quality of the steel and the carbide and the accuracy. Like I said, this is just a standard set that I have. You can get them at a big box store. The next stack that I wanted to look at is the Freud dial-a-width dado, which is kind of neat. It's got the same kind of a deal. It has 2 saw blades for the outer portion, and you can see it's got the alternating top bevel ground on each of the teeth as well, so it's great for cross cuts. And it's got a whole bunch of these 4-tooth chippers. They're flat ground, just like the chippers on the other set. There are 4 teeth on each chipper as opposed to only 2. The great thing about this is you don't need to have any washers or anything to infinitely adjust this. This has this cam washer that, as you can see, the tighter I make it, the more it protrudes from the interior of the saw plate. Or, conversely, I can unscrew it and bring it all the way down to actually below flush. And then this stabilizer actually functions to keep the saw blades from wobbling around. And you can see, if you can actually feel it click into position, and that's about 4 thousandths is what you're increasing and decreasing for each indent on that stack. This stack dado starts at around $225, $250, somewhere in that ballpark. I think when I bought mine, it was still fairly new, and it was closer to 400 or so. It's definitely worth the money, because you can take this stack and increase it and decrease it to fit 3/4 inch plywood, which I don't know where you get your 3/4 inch plywood, but mine never comes through at 3/4 of an inch. 1/2 inch doesn't come in at 1/2 inch either. They're both slightly under, which makes it really easy to get this thing fine-tuned so that you get an absolutely perfect fit. So this final stack doesn't really look like a stack, but it is. If I remove the top plate, you can see that it's got an inner and outer plate, just like the other 2 stack dados, in that that's what creates those outer cuts. It's got these little nickers, or they're actually the carbide inserts that you would find on a spiral head for a joiner or a planer. And then it's got a raker tooth that follows along and cleans out the material in between. So what you get with this is more like a shaper or a router cut coming off of the table saw. Realistically, these nickers come around and they do exactly what that ATB tooth does on a regular carbide blade. By coming up there to that point, it actually slices across and scores the cross-grain fibers so that you don't get tear out. And this does it really well. These are super sharp. And then you have that raker tooth that comes in behind. This comes in two different versions. You can get the double plate, or there's a third plate that you can add. And what it does is it gives you a wide variety of widths. Oops, I have it upside down there. So this would be the two stack. It can get you down to about 3/8 of an inch with both in there. And if I swap the bigger plate out for the smaller one, I can get up to beyond 3/4 of an inch. And it also comes with a whole series of varying thickness, precision milled washers that happen to fit. This stack dado is the most expensive of the bunch at around $600 or so. I think the larger kit might be even a little bit more with everything. And the biggest drawback, if you have a standard Western style table saw with a 5/8 inch arbor, this only comes in the 30 mil with the 2 indexing pins to be used on a European style saw. Specifically, it can be used on the hammer and the Felder saws. There's lots of other European saws that this would fit as well. So if you have a sliding table saw or something that has a 30 mil arbor, you can certainly get this stack dado. And you'll see when we go over and start cutting dados and rabbets with the stacks that this thing leaves an absolutely flawless finish. There's no tear out. It's an absolutely flat bottom. The problem you have to worry about with the ATB teeth on the standard stack dados are, and it doesn't matter whether it's just your ordinary stack dado or even to some degree when you get into the Freud dado, because it's got that really sharp angled tooth on there so that it slices across those fibers, it leaves those little bat ears in the corner of your dados and your rabbets, where the Felder stack just leaves absolutely no machine marks whatsoever, nothing into the corners. There's nothing that shows once the dado or the rabbet is cut. Now, you stack this thing up pretty much the same way. It'll only go together in one direction. You can see it's got these, there's a roll pin on one side and an indexing hole on the other. Same thing on the mating plate. And you can't put it together wrong because it just won't fit. You can't put the two roll pins together. And to expand the stack out, the washers have the holes in there too. Now they've given you some extra holes so that you don't have to be absolutely perfectly aligned, depending on which way you have the stack set up. You can flip the washer around, but they line up with the two roll pins as well. So this way you don't end up with these things being shifted to one side or anything like that. And they've got that 30 mil hole milled just absolutely perfectly right up the center. So again, this stuff really leaves a flawless kind of a finish until I got my hammer saw in the shop, my go-to stack dado was the Freud dado. The original stack was something that I had from the very beginning of my career. It wasn't too expensive. It was under $100, like I said. Then when I found out about the Freud with dado, one of my students actually brought his into the shop during a class so that we could try it out. And I immediately ran right out and bought one. For a standard 5/8 inch arbor on a saw, this thing is just really amazing. It leaves a really nice cut. Not too much in the way of saw marks, not quite the same quality you get out of a standard stack. This thing's pretty amazing. And that was my go-to for a very long time. And then when I got my Hammer K3 slider into the shop and put this Felder stack dado on there, it just completely changed the way that I cut dados, and it feels so much different than either of the other two stacks. When you set up a stack dado, particularly when you're running grooves with the grain, and you're doing something of substantial width, say 3/4 of an inch, you have an awful lot of just basically saw blades functioning together here that are providing an awful lot of resistance as you push the material through. If I set up the Felder stack at 3/4 of an inch, because of the mass of the outer plates, they function, like I said, more like a shaper cutter, and that mass gives you zero vibration with that, along with that 30 mil arbor hole. You can really, it's pretty amazing. The first time I ever used it, I was at Felder's showroom, and I set up the stack at about 5/8 of an inch or so. We took a piece of 12/4 oak and set the depth of cut for this thing close to an inch. And it sliced through a piece of white oak at about 5/8 wide, 1 inch deep, like it was a hot knife going through butter. You didn't feel any vibration, you felt no resistance, and the finish was absolutely flawless. So I think the next thing is let's head to the table saw. We'll set up the stack dados and give them a test run and give you some tips for when you run your rabbets and your dados and even your grooves. So here at the Powermatic 66, it is a left tilt saw. So the arbor is on the left side of the slot there. I'm going to set up the Freud dado because that's the one I tend to use the most. I'm going to take the first outer blade, set it in. You can see it's got a recessed stabilizer on it. Set it over the arbor, pull it in over top of the nut, and I'm going to set it up with a couple of inside chippers. You want to make sure that the teeth are facing in the forward position here. You don't want them turned around backwards. Same thing on your outside saw blades too. I've seen a lot of people try and install these things backwards. You want to make sure that the carbide teeth are facing. This is the side you're going to start cutting into the blade with. So you want to make sure those carbide teeth are facing forward. The next one, you can see I took it and I've got it set up so that the carbide teeth fall into the gullets between the other teeth. I'm going to put this set on and rotate it so that not only am I in between the spaces between these two teeth on that first chipper, but I want it nice and even if I can get it, because that will keep my weight distributed. It'll also mean that I get a more even cut as the saw blades hit the material. And my final one, again, making sure that my teeth on the outer saw blade fall in those gullets in between the carbide teeth on the chippers. Then, because it's got that stabilizer washer built into the outside, the only thing you need to do is put the regular nut on there. If I was using my other normal ordinary stack, I would have to put the stabilizer washer back on that goes on with my regular individual saw blades. You can see I don't have a ton of room here to work inside this thing, but that's one of the drawbacks. When we get over to the hammer saw, you'll see there's easily twice as much room to get around and work in there. So when I tighten up the nut on there, I'll either grab the stack and just do it by hand, or sometimes I'll take a scrap stick there and just give it about once it fetches up snug, give it maybe another eighth or so turn, and then put my throat plate in and I am ready to go. All I need to do is adjust this and cut some rabbets and dados and grooves. I lowered the blade down. In fact, I added a couple more chippers in there. Set up a sacrificial fence on the saw, and you can see I've also got a feather board holding that material down. The first thing I'm going to do is run a rabbet along the length of the board. I want that feather board in position to keep constant downward pressure on my material, because the stack dado tends to push that material up and back. Without the feather board, I wouldn't get a consistent depth on either of my two rabbets. You can see the stack dado left a really nice surface, although you can see the end cut was a little deeper than the side. If I move the fence over and remove the sacrificial fence, now I'm going to make a dado and a groove in the same board. You'll notice that I'm using a hold down to put downward pressure directly over the stack dado as I make both the dado and the groove. Here at the Hammer K3, I have removed my riving knife, the blade, and there's also a stabilizer washer that's behind the blade. And what that's done is it's exposed enough of the arbor that I can now install the stack. So if I take the outer plate, make sure that the teeth are facing forward, put the two indexing pins on there, I slide it right over the arbor and back into place. I could then add any or all of my washers. This group of washers gives me the perfect thickness for 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. So I'm going to attach all of these washers to the stack. The final thing that I'm going to do is my roll pin is down on the bottom on this first plate. So that means I have to have my roll pin up top. Rotate it in. Get everything a little twisted. There we go. I got it right in there. And now Felder also supplies a slightly different retaining nut on the outside. It's got a much deeper socket, because that way if you're using a smaller dado stack, the end of the arbor is compensated for inside of that deep stabilizer washer. The really cool thing about this saw, besides the fact that it's got the slider, is you've got plenty of room in here to work. The cap screw that holds everything in place is forward threaded. No remembering, hey, do I have to go forward or backward here? Those extra two pins stop it from unwinding when the brake kicks in on the saw. So that's all there is to setting it up. So the only thing I have to install now is the proper throat plate. That just sets down in here, and it is not held down by gravity, but it's held down by a whole bunch of small cap screws that go right down and in. I usually start sort of in the middle and work my way out. I just bring them until they're just slightly tightened up. And flush with the table. So now that I've got everything installed, I can close up my guard. The saw is now active. I can adjust my height, set my fence, do whatever I need to. I think we got to cut some rabbets, dados, and grooves. Again, after I have my height set and my sacrificial fence in place with a featherboard on it, I can use the slider to actually push the material through and make both a side and an end rabbet. That Felder stack dado really leaves a super clean surface and there's no variations. Moving the fence over, removing the sacrificial fence, but keeping the featherboard, I can now run a groove and a dado and I get the exact same results. In addition to the featherboard, it's also a good idea, if you can, to use clamps to hold your material down to your sled or your sliding table. Well, that just about covers everything I know about dados, rabbets, and grooves here at the table saw anyway. Just to recap real quick, when you do your layouts, make sure that you're transferring your lines from board to board. Try to eliminate as much of that measuring as possible. I mean, if you go back and look at what I did earlier in the seminar, if you look at the way that I made the rabbets and dados, when I set up to make the rabbet, I literally held the two boards together, transferred that mark from one to the other, and then used those marks to set up my table saw to cut it both in the two-step method and with a stack dado. If you have a table saw that will not accept a stack dado, don't panic. You don't need to go out and buy a new table saw unless you're looking for an excuse or justification, in which case I'm happy to take the blame and told you you need to go get a new table saw. But you don't need one in order to be able to create rabbets, dados, and grooves. Obviously, I did them here at the table saw with just a single blade. That two-step method for making rabbets is really a quick and easy way to make them, and it avoids having to set up that stack dado every single time you want to. If you can, or you have a table saw that will take a stack dado, it is definitely worth your time and money to go out and get one. Even a cheap one will increase your accuracy, especially on those repetitive things. If you're making a bookcase and you want to run a whole bunch of dados for shelves, so much faster, so much more accurate to set the stack dado up, get it dialed in just right, and then make all of your cuts in your case sides. They'll all be very consistent and accurate so that you get that perfect fit every single time. If you can get yourself a stack dado for your saw, be sure when you set it up that you are setting it up in the right direction. Number one, I've seen a lot of people set it up with the outer blades in there backwards. It has to run like a regular table saw blade because they are regular table saw blades. You also want to make sure that you are offsetting all the carbide teeth on both the outer blades and the chippers so that they don't come in contact with one another. You want those things sort of in the spaces in between, those gullets on those outer saw blades, so that you don't chip a tooth, you don't bend a saw plate, or knock a tooth completely off. All of those things are not good. So get yourself a stack dado if you can. Get your saw set up. have some fun making rabbets, dados, and grooves.